I'm Dan Petrick. I'm the Shoreland Program Manager at the DNR. I manage a variety of statewide programs that regulate land use um, through local, county, and zoning ordinances. The largest of these programs is the Shoreland program. And so I am a planner by training. I have degrees in landscape architecture and planning, but I have been practicing as a planner for the past 25 years. I've been with the DNR for about 15 years. So I've been working with cities and counties and designing and writing zoning ordinances and reviewing and approving projects, conditional use permits, planned unit developments, land use development essentially. And I am not an expert in restoration. So please, I don't look at me as a restoration expert. I am here to share with you what I know in that area, but there's also some other useful topics that go into this discussion as well. And so today I'd like to cover with you these four things. I'd like to start off by talking about the laws in Minnesota that affect shoreline vegetation. We'll talk a bit about a report that has been recently produced that talks about how we're losing our shorelines, our natural shorelines. Talk about how climate is affecting natural shorelines and water quality. And then lastly, we'll talk about some elements of a restoration plan. So hopefully that all sounds good to you, and we'll move on. So this is sort of images of what most of us think about when it comes to natural shorelines or buffers in Minnesota. You might take exceptions with a couple of these images, but by and large, this is what we think of as ideal shoreline vegetation. It's kind of vegetation that's always been here, and we wish it would always be here, but that's not the case, because oftentimes this is what a lot of our shorelines are starting to look like. And it's obvious that we have a lack of shoreline vegetation that's leading to erosion, failure, algae growth. So not good things. And, why is that? Well, there's a lot of challenges that we face in our world today around lakes and rivers. Size and scale of development is a biggie. We don't have small cabins anymore, or at least they're becoming a rarity. They've all been replaced with larger cabins or seasonal or permanent homes. We have growing preference for a suburban style of landscaping that often includes lots of turf grass and hardscaping. We also have a changing climate. And, I have to tell anybody here that our winters are getting warmer. We have less and less lake ice, or certainly the lake ice season is changing. And we also have warming water temperatures. But also, too, we've relied on in the past a regulatory approach towards protecting our shoreline vegetation. And, alone, our regulatory approach simply isn't enough. And we'll cover those just in a moment. But, the first I just want to touch on that doesn't play a big role around lakes and rivers is the 2017 Minnesota Buffer Law. This was a sort of a landmark bill that was passed in 2017. And we have generally around the state very good compliance on this. And, the law was passed to really help filter out phosphorus and nitrogen that was coming in from a lot of ag crops into our drainage system, into our rivers and streams. And so what we have here is sort of a very nice description of what, or illustration of what a shoreline buffer should be in an ag area. And excuse me, just to summarize what this law does, it requires a 50-foot average or 30-foot minimum buffer around public waters and a 16.5-foot buffer around drainage ditches. And so under the buffer law, buffers are required to be in perennial vegetation, excluding invasive plants and noxious weeds. But grass does qualify as a perennial vegetation, and grass is what we have around most homes in shoreland areas. So under the Minnesota buffer law, having a turf grass lawn generally doesn't conflict with this law, even though you might think that's not quite right. This particular law is administered through the Board of Water and Soil Resources and implemented at the local level through watershed districts, local governments, counties or cities, and Bowser if no one else at a local level is willing to do that. DNR has a role in this law in that we maintain the statewide buffer map, which looks like this. You can go to our website, search for this buffer map, and you'll be taken to a website, and then you can scroll around and see how the different water bodies throughout the state are classified. Just briefly here, if it's outlined in blue, that means it has to have a 50-foot buffer on average or a 30-foot minimum. And if it's shown in green, that means it needs a 16.5-foot buffer. In most cases, those 16.5-foot streams are drainage ditches. So let's talk about the Shoreland Management Act from 1969. This is the beginning of an important era in Minnesota and around the country in terms of environmental protection. The state was seeing widespread development of its shoreland areas, a lot of press coverage of that. It eventually led to the 1969 Shoreland Management Act. And so that eventually then supported and authorized the DNR to make rules in, first of all, in the 1970s for the Shoreland Management Program. Those rules were updated in 1989, and those are still the rules we live with today. So just keep in mind, 89 was still kind of a world away from today in terms of development style and practices. So we're dealing with a set of regulations that really aren't quite adapted to today's environment. But the program, which is administered by counties and cities, regulates development around lakes. Counties have to regulate development on lakes over 25 acres and cities on lakes over 10 acres. That also includes larger wetlands that fit those size dimensions, as well as all public waters and rivers and streams that drain more than 2 acres. So every water body that qualifies for shoreland gets a classification, and that classification is used to regulate certain dimensional standards. But these are the particular areas. If you're around a lake, it's 1,000 feet where the regulations apply, or if a stream, it's 300 feet around a stream. When we get into talking about vegetation, it's important to understand that cities and counties have to administer a shore impact zone. And the shore impact zone is the nearshore area. It's 50% of the structure setback for a particular classified lake type. And within that shore impact zone, there are some strict limits on vegetation. Under the standards, there is no intensive clearing within this area. There is a provision for limited clearing for a variety of nearshore uses, but unfortunately, there's no requirement to restore if somebody were to remove it. And it's very difficult to enforce, and that's part of one of the limitations we have with this regulatory approach. Cities and counties, have thousands and thousands of miles in some cases of shoreline to monitor. There simply aren't the resources to do that, and it's very difficult to know when somebody, cuts down a nice riparian buffer. So that's sort of the state that we're in. But it's important that these buffers remain in place or get restored. They are a huge benefit to protecting water quality. If we have an undeveloped lakeshore, like on the very left-hand side of the screen, there's a very small baseline amount of runoff, phosphorus and sediment that flow into the lake. The arrows, the red refers to just stormwater runoff, the green refers to phosphorus runoff, and the brown refers to sediment. And we do know that sediment is a pollutant in and of itself, but it also carries with it phosphorus and also other pollutants like metals and other bad stuff. So if we were to even modestly develop a piece of shoreline property, we see the runoff and the phosphorus inputs remaining fairly constant with a 4-time increase in sediments. But if we go in for a very sort of large scale contemporary development, we see that, all the inputs increase and sediment inputs increase dramatically. So maintaining a natural shore, repairing shoreline, is really important to keeping phosphorus and sediment out of our waters. So I want to turn to some work that's been done recently that's been exploring our losses of natural shoreline. The DNR is part of a group called the Natural Shorelines Partnership, which is a variety of state agencies and local and non-governmental organizations that are interested in conservation and shoreline protection. And we have been working to try to develop a case for stronger protection of natural shorelines. And part of that was to develop this report that documents our vanishing shorelines. And this report was presented to the Clean Water Council in the summer of 2022. The organization is continuing to strategize and coordinate with like-minded organizations to try to increase awareness of this problem. And so one of the interesting pieces of this report, oh, and by the way, if you're interested in this report, if you go to the Minnesota Lakes and Rivers Advocates website, you'll find this report. This is where this report, the final version of it is hosted. It's not an official DNR publication, but if you're interested, go to Minnesota Lakes and Rivers. So this is a very interesting piece of the report that I wanted to share with you. This graphic is a bit complex, so bear with me. It's based on an understanding of how shorelines natural shorelines are disappearing, and it's based on a survey that the DNR conducts called a Score the Shore survey. This survey is used to estimate the amount of natural habitat in 3 lake zones, aquatic, shoreline, and shoreland, in 100-foot segments. These are samples that are done on lakes that the DNR is surveying for fish populations. And so these surveys are done regularly and updated, and it basically ranks lakes on the amount of remaining natural conditions. And so you can see here on the graph that the lakes that are surveyed have a color associated with them. If it's a blue color, that means that high levels of intact vegetation exist. And if it's red, very low levels of natural vegetation exist. And you can see the pie graphs, which are representative of the results of the survey in each of the 4 administrative districts that the DNR uses. So if you look up in Northeast Minnesota, you'll see a larger percentage of blue or high quality natural lakes and a fairly large number of moderately protected lakes in terms of natural vegetation. You see in the central and southeast Minnesota that we have a very large percentage of lakes that are rated very low, meaning they have very low levels of natural vegetation left. So it's an interesting study. Over time, the study has found that we've lost about 40 to 50% statewide of our natural shorelines, and that we lose about 1 to 2% every year. So another interesting piece that's discussed in the report is how much phosphorus leads to algae production. 1 pound of phosphorus produces about 500 pounds of algae, and to put that into context, on sort of a standard lot that you might see in the shoreline area, that might be about 100 feet by about 100 to 500 feet or so, you get about 0.2 pounds of phosphorus per summer per lot. And if you add that up, say for 100 lots around a lake, that produces 20 pounds of phosphorus, or converted into 10,000 pounds of algae. So, in some of these lakes that have very little natural vegetation left anymore, phosphorus just runs off in liquid form from from turf grasses right into the lake, and does help produce a lot of this. So, part of the reason we see this problem growing is that we have this cultural obsession with lawns, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. People want to be able to see the lake. They think lawns look nice, and they don't want weeds. And yes, lawns are very practical and easy to maintain, but a lawn without a buffer between it and the lake is big trouble. And so, we need to be thinking about how can we work in our communities to build social change, if you will, change the social dynamics and value systems towards a more natural aesthetic and a more of a ecology-based value system. So let's talk a bit about how climate trends are affecting this landscape. As you know, our climate is changing and the change of pace is accelerating. Over the past 50 years, we've seen a lot of metrics change on this. We're simply getting warmer. In the past 50 years, 3.5 times faster than, the last century and plus. You can see the rate of change there. From 1895 to 69 was quite low. And then 1970 to 2022, 3.8 times faster. We know our winters are getting warmer again, dramatically faster in the past 50 some years. Our lakes are also getting warmer. Many people may not be aware of that, but this data comes from the PCA's, forget the name of your website, Shannon, but some very good data there about lakes. And over the past 50 years, our lakes have been increasing in temperature about 3.1 to 3.9 degrees per over that period of time. And so that's an important thing to remember when we get talking about phosphorus. Also, I don't have to tell anybody our lake ice season is also shortening. And we've also, of course, been having increases in significant events. And so with all these things combined, they are having an impact on shoreline development. And we just have a series of graphics here to sort of make the case for that. If you will, here is our ideal natural shoreline environment. No one is intensely or clear-cut the shoreline vegetation. We have a natural background of nutrient flows moving in to the water body. So everything is essentially in balance here. Now we modify this a bit by taking out the natural vegetation, putting in a lawn, putting in some hardscaping, and we add a little bit of rainfall to this. We start getting many more nutrients running off, both in sort of the liquid runoff, but also in the eroded sediment. And at this point, the nutrient flow starts to exceed what is needed for aquatic plant life and aquatic animal life. And we see water starting to turn green. So let's think about what happens with increased rainfall and intensity as our climate changes. We have obviously a lot more of that coming down, and we have even greater amounts of nutrients flowing in due to these intense rainfall events moving runoff much more quickly into the water. And we get more algae growth in the water, and you add warming water temperatures, which serve to accelerate the growth of algae. You get, highly eutrophied waters and loss of animal life, fish and other critters that live in the water or depend on them. So this is a trend that we see. Climate change is really changing sort of the dynamic of how we think about the impact phosphorus has on the ecology of a lake. So with that, the last part of this discussion is just to talk about the elements of restoration. Obviously, many parts of our state, the shorelines are in desperate need of restoration. And so We are certainly encouraging people to do that, and here's some ways to think about this. Any restoration project should be thought as a sort of a methodical project, and the first step is really evaluating your site. Really, this sort of goes into scoping the project, but you want to establish goals. You want to consider the approach you want to take, look for some technical resources to help you, and possibly some funding. And so let's look at site evaluation. This is really the part where you look at your site critically, either you yourself with some self-help tools or you bring in an expert, but you want to identify the problems on your site. Do you have some erosion going on? Do you have a problem with certain types of invasives taking over? Do you have some difficult slopes to work with? Where are those slopes? What kind of vegetation do you have? Can you keep any of it? Is it good to keep? And then you're going to want to, after doing that, establish your goals, which are intrinsically linked to your budget, which is intrinsically linked to the scope or approach, because, everybody has a budget, and that budget will determine which goals you can bite off and which ones you can't, which then will affect your scale or approach. Many projects might require the need of a professional, or you can do it possibly depending on your scope. So there's the design element, there's the installation, and then there's the long-term maintenance, which are key parts of any sort of restoration project. When it comes to site evaluation, Blue Thumb has some really excellent resources on their webpage that help you walk through in a very methodical manner with some nice checklists to identify problems with your site and then possible solutions. The DNR has a Score the Shore program. It's different from the survey I spoke to you about earlier. That's an internal survey that DNR ecologists use. But the Score the Shore is on our webpage, and it helps you to evaluate your site, and then it also takes you into a restore your shore sequence of events on how you might actually restore it based on the score. And that tool has a lot of resources in terms of plant recommendations. So the next phase would be to establish your goals. There's a wide range of things that you might emphasize in your restoration. What's the habitat and what kind of habitat would you like to provide? Depends greatly on where you are in the state, but this is a very important consideration. You might also want to think about phosphorus runoff. What is the shape of your lake now? Is it somewhat impaired? Is it trending towards impairment? Is it in great shape? That would probably influence the type of vegetation you choose and where you put it, and consider what's upstream. What kind of runoff are you getting? So a lot of considerations there in developing goals. Aesthetics are also very important. We've learned that aesthetics vary tremendously depending on where you are in the state. Not that they're important, but what qualifies as important. Aesthetics in Northeast Minnesota are very different than Southwestern Minnesota. And so, it's sometimes helpful to think about the local values in your area so that maybe you can encourage others in your area to do something that might align with what they already think is important. So there's that whole social kind of narrative involved in aesthetics. Also, the maintainability, natural shoreline maintenance, especially in the early years of a restoration, can be very labor intensive. Do you have the ability to do that, or do you have people you could hire to take care of that? Very important considerations. And then lastly, if you have any serious erosion problems, that oftentimes would require a professional to help you resolve. So here are some approaches from very simple to more complicated. At the very simple end of that spectrum is a no-mow approach. You simply, as it sounds like, you stop mowing and see what happens. You know, it's a very low cost operation. It's easy to maintain. You'll get some improvement in habitat, most likely. You may have some reduction in phosphorus. Maybe aesthetics will improve. But it's not great for stabilizing serious problems. And, you know, frankly, it may not look that great. And you might have a lot of invasives that pop in as well. So you may have to do more work in trying to establish this than otherwise. But it's certainly a very viable approach, and it's better than doing nothing. So this is one starting point to consider. Kind of a variation on that is to supplement no-mow with some new installations. So what you might do in this case here is identify some areas where you're going to stop mowing. You would treat your turf grass as an invasive and you know, remove it with some sort of method, either chemical or not, but you want to be careful on how you use chemicals. But once you do that, then you fill in with some natives, and you know, in this case here, you can have a very nice result, and it's still sort of a manicured look that might appeal depending on where you live in the state. So, you know, depending on what you plant, this could be easier or more difficult to maintain. It's sort of up to the owner's decision on how they approach maintenance. It's a great opportunity for pollinators, so you really can improve habitat for insects and birds. And you can certainly reduce phosphorus flow, and, you know, it looks nice, you know, I think. But again, this sort of approach isn't really good for stabilizing serious soil loss or erosion problems. Sort of next up the spectrum would be a full restoration. This is where you treat the entire site and restore it with a combination of native seeds and seedlings, or, you know, bare root sort of thing. This is going to cost more, and you definitely have to comply with a maintenance plan and its implementation for it to really work. And these tend to be a little more expensive, so you do want to make sure it's maintained to make it worth and pay off over the long term. So these can definitely improve the reduction in phosphorus runoff, and also can really improve the aesthetics of an area. And usually these are done with a professional and can also deal with more serious problems around stabilization. And then just, you know, want to remind everyone that when you get into this world of restoration, maintenance is really important to keep in mind. These projects definitely require maintenance post-installation for probably 2 to 5 years, requiring watering through droughts, weeding, removing invasives that constantly want to invade your site. And depending on how kind of property you might share with others, you might need to put up some signage or fencing to make sure that someone doesn't inadvertently sort of mow into the area or do something to it that you would prefer they didn't. So lots to keep in mind there. Also, it's sort of a side note to some situations, but keep in mind that depending on how extensive your restoration project might be, there might be some requirements to get permits. Depending on where you live, that could be a watershed district. If you're doing any work at or near the ordinary high water level, you'd want to talk to the DNR area hydrologist to make sure if you need a permit, that you get the permit, or that somebody has reviewed your plans to make sure that you're doing it under compliant with state laws. And I'll just talk about how you identify that sort of jurisdictional boundary between the DNR and sort of your local government. So the ordinary high is that jurisdictional boundary. It's this place on the landscape where there is a change in vegetation from mostly aquatic to mostly terrestrial. It's not the average water level, but it's where the water level might ordinarily rise to on a regular basis. And so in a situation, and anything below that ordinary high is the DNR's jurisdiction. And if you're going to do some restoration or removal of, say, some riprap or a wall, it's probably at or below the ordinary high water level, and you'd probably want to check with the DNR and how the best way would be to run that sort of restoration. Just here's sort of graphically what that means. You've got the ordinary high water level running through here, and above that is the local government's jurisdiction, whether that be a watershed district or your city or county, and below that would be the DNR for public water rules permitting. And so yeah, that's pretty much it. Here are some resources that I relied on for this presentation. They're also a good starting point for anybody who wants to investigate a restoration or understand more about how Minnesota shorelines are vanishing. And so I can send this to Shannon and she can distribute this to all of you. These are all clickable links, so that'll make it easier for you to find these resources. So, so that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was great. Yes, I did have, someone has asked for a copy of the presentation. So we've recorded this, and so the presentation, a record of the presentation will go out, but someone has asked for either the PowerPoint or if you don't want to share the exact PowerPoint, maybe like a PDF of it would be great as well. Sure. And then I can send that out to everyone when I send a link to the recording.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. We did have a question here. Someone was wondering if you are able to approximate how many bags of leaves and grass clippings equals 1 pound of phosphorus.
Oh boy, that's not my wheelhouse. I'm a planner, not a scientist. Sorry.
That's okay. I bet there's somewhere we can go to get that information.
Yeah.
I had another email come in prior to this presentation, and they were saying that, okay, so their Isanti SWCD hired shoreline restoration consultants, and they'd recommended shoreline restorations for years, but they had a significant failure rate due to the lake's wide, like large fetch and then the strong winds that would come through. And then the failure rate caused like really bad congested shorelines filled with sort of the torn up native restoration debris. And so like a lot of money was kind of wasted. And so they're saying sort of in such cases, they thought they read in the DNR's website that a hard armor with natural filtration 15-foot buffer behind it, and then that would allow the plants to sort of populate the riprap. They didn't know if you had any thoughts or comments on something like that.
Yes, hard armoring combined with sort of a natural or bioengineered approach is ideal for situations like that where you have a large fetch and problems with wind and ice heaves or ice ridges forming, because they can really destroy your land-based vegetation that's been very carefully planted and sustained over time, and that would be an awful thing. So there are certainly places for that, and we definitely recommend that. You know, I didn't include anything on that here, but there are some counties that are sort of promoting that sort of approach. I think Stearns County has some resources that they've put into place. I think Carlton has been involved in this a little bit more, trying to integrate sort of hard armoring with some of the natural bioengineering to protect shorelines in very vulnerable areas like that. And so that if you're in a very stressful area like that, we'd definitely recommend hard armoring, integrating planting material, and as the preferred approach.
Another question, how do you differentiate between a river and a lake? So in reference to Lake Zumbro Watershed District in Olmsted County, is this why Lake Zumbro is not on the map in your PowerPoint?
So I'm assuming somebody went to the buffer map. Is that what they're saying? And Zumbro Lake was not on the buffer map? Is that what you mean?
That could be Tammy. Tammy, if you want to just unmute and ask your question as well, if you know where you saw it on the map, feel free to do so.
Sure, I just noticed it on your PowerPoint presentation that you had, and I zoomed in on Olmsted County, and I just didn't see Lake Zumbro on there. And so I was just curious as to why that wasn't on there. We are a fish management area with the DNR where they release walleye fingerlings into our lake every year. So I just wondered if your PowerPoint just didn't reflect Lake Zumbro, or if I should go somewhere else to look at and see what the health of our lake is.
Are you talking? Going way back a ways here.
Sorry. Oh, there you go.
This lake, this map? Or is this the map you were referring to?
Oh, there was the one that had flags, yellow, red, green.
Oh, that one. You know, it might be that that Lake Zumbro is not included in the survey.
Okay, that makes sense. That's just what
Yeah.
I was about.
Yeah.
But still,
Yeah.
the question, if you could answer, how do they differentiate between because it's a reservoir, obviously, Lake Zumbro is. So would most of that be considered a lake or a stream bank?
I'm going to speculate that it's a lake. Most I don't know, impoundments in Minnesota are categorized as a lake. In terms of our ID system and how we classify them, that's not always the case, but that's generally the rule. And then oftentimes, like when we remove a dam, which is something that we have been working on to try to restore natural fish passages and restore the natural flows, something that was once classified as an impoundment or a basin. You know, it's a lake, but it's sort of a basin, how we call these things. It would be then reclassified back to being a stream again. So I can't say I haven't looked up the data, you know, for like Zumbro, but that's generally how we operate when we classify things. So it would be considered a lake, and under the shoreline regulations, we would consider it a lake in terms of regulations and the district around it that is covered under shoreline standards.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was just looking it up on the MPCA's website, and it looks like I think we're classifying it as a lake too in terms of like the data that's collected. It looks like it's, you know, Secchi disc data, not Secchi tube data, and the classification for impairments looks like it's being used as a lake. So it looks like it was classified as standards not being met, so it was impaired in 2001.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that help.
Yeah. So another question, do you have plant suggestions for restoring a steep bank? Like they already have landscape fabric in place, but it's slow to get seeds started.
You know, I'm not a plant expert, but the under our Restore the Shore plant selection guide, there are a variety of criteria you can plug into the system. One of which I believe has to do with importance of stabilization, you know, soil stabilization, and it would come back with some recommendations. There's a lot of plant sort of pickers, calculators that help with that. But yeah, I can't think off the top of my head what something like that would be. You know, sorry.
Oh, Waverly, thank you. She said she was looking online, and a few places are saying that 5 garbage bags of leaves or clippings equals 1 pound of phosphorus.
Oh, well, thank you. Yep. Yeah. Keep it out of the lake. You wouldn't believe how many people still will kind of rake their leaves, especially down a ravine side that leads to a creek. You know, it's just, you know, a really unfortunate practice, you know.
Mm-hmm. Someone had said, are there different sets of regulations regarding ordinary high water levels in residential, like Minnehaha Creek, and rural compared to like a whitewater river areas? So are there different sets of regulations depending upon if you're more residential than more rural?
No, the ordinary high water level is based really on sort of where the vegetation changes from mostly aquatic to mostly terrestrial. In streams, that's a little more difficult to establish. And generally the rule of thumb there is if there's no clear demarcation, then it would just be the top of bank becomes the ordinary high. And below that level then is the DNR's jurisdictional authority for regulating sort of work in the water. So if you want to do some excavation or build a structure, DNR has permitting authority. Above that level, the local government would have authority. And so, it happens to be whatever that local government's regulations are for that particular area. And we know that they all have zoning, and zoning standards vary depending on whether it's residential or commercial. So above the ordinary high, it's whatever your local zoning standards are. You check with your city or county, whoever has jurisdiction. But below that, it's the DNR has jurisdiction, and we don't distinguish between residential properties or, industrial or commercial.
Thank you. And Gordon put some helpful information in the chat too, more about how much lake weeds, how many tons of it equal how much nitrogen and phosphorus too. So if you guys want to look in the chat section, there's some more good stuff there. Great. And Patrick provided some more info on Lake Zumbro too, which was great. Any other questions? Oh, good. What are some good resources for those who are interested in starting a career as an environmental restoration planner, specifically working on lake and stream shorelines?
Well, a good place, career paths that might lead somebody to work at a watershed organization. People who are interested in hydrology, ecology. Those are the sort of degree paths that are hired. People like that are hired by watershed districts and Board of Water and Soil Resources, the DNR as well. Depending on the unit, the DNR has a wide variety of regulatory units and specialties. But anyone who goes into career of ecology, landscape ecology, hydrology, those are all good technical skills for a career in those fields. There's a lot of consulting firms that do work in this area as well, and they hire people with the same types of skills.
Someone was wondering, is there any wider initiative for shoreline assessment than Score the Shore?
Well, the DNR has a great tool. It's somewhat complicated to use, but it's it's our watershed health assessment tool, and I am just showing on the screen right now a close-up of Big Portage Lake, which I believe is, I'm not sure which county it's in, but this is a fabulous tool for all kinds of information on lakes. I've got the hydrology tab opened up here, which has a scoring system for overall hydrologic health. And part of that health is based on a Score the Shore score. And this is the graphic I was just showing you for how different lakes that are sampled throughout the state vary. But this particular tool, the Watershed Health Assessment for Lakes, has a lot of information on hydrology for each individual lake. It also has a tab on biological scores for different criteria. And it also has a lot of information scoring water quality. And so all of these scores go together to come up sort of with a summary score for lake health. And you can search any lake in the state by county or by watershed and really drill down into a lot of this data. Much of this data is imported from PCA data sources. And it's a fascinating tool if you really want to understand your particular lake and what's going on with it and areas that are needed for improvement. Especially the stewardship tab talks about, the stewardship factors and how, it gets a grade score, but things that can be done to improve the stewardship So I'm not sure if any of you are aware of this yet, but if you go to the DNR's website and just search for Watershed Health Assessment Framework for Lakes, you'll get this tool. Lots of good stuff here. We have just a general watershed health assessment framework that is another tool that's slightly different. But if you want just lakes, search for this, and you'll get to this tool that just serves lakes.
It is a great tool. We did a virtual Secchi Social 2 years ago. It's like our annual volunteer get together. And the virtual one we did a couple of years ago, we did have a presentation on this watershed health assessment framework because it is so great. And volunteer data is used in it. So yeah, it's really nice.
Yeah.
I just put I'm going to put in the chat here, the links to all the different videos that you guys have. So I didn't even know they all existed, Dan. And so that's how I found you, is when I was like, just looking for stuff. And I was like, hey, there's all these awesome videos. So I just wanted to put that out there too, that you guys have the DNR and you guys have a lot of helpful information online too about shoreline training and planning.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I'm just sharing the front page on that link that you're probably sharing. So yeah, we have some good stuff here too, especially on other things like nonconformities and how our climate is affecting. So there's a sort of a climate presentation here, as well as a presentation on nonconforming law in Minnesota and how that affects shoreline properties.
Oh, we just had another question come in. I'm curious about wind impacts. We have a small family cabin near Grand Rapids, all natural shoreline, but it's on the southeast corner of the lake and now just gets hammered by waves when there are storms. We're losing shoreline. It's a hill. Just wonder how wind might factor in.
Well, I mean, you got your hill is absorbing a lot of wind action, and it sounds like I can't say that being a hill is any worse for it, but it's going to create more and more difficult access to the lake. If you've already got a hill there and that hillside is starting to erode at the very bottom along the shoreline, if it's a serious problem, I think it probably is time to invest in a sort of a long-term solution. And I hate to say it, but it probably requires some hard armoring in that case. But definitely someone with some technical, maybe engineering experience in how to solve that problem. And if your adjacent neighbors are suffering in the same way, it might behoove you to even cooperate kind of with adjacent property owners to try to solve this problem together. Because when one person tries to solve it, it sort of deflects the problem to neighboring properties. And so, energy has to go somewhere. And so all that wind energy and the waves, if they're deflected from some hard armoring device, it's going to affect neighboring properties.
Good, great, thank you. Any other questions? All right. Well, this was really great. We've had great participation. I know a lot of people are looking forward to the recorded presentation as well. Great questions from everybody. And Dan, thank you so much for joining us and giving us all this really helpful information. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Glad I could help out today.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And I'll follow up then in a few days with the recording presentation and more information.
Okay. All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.